Hey Star Trek fans, Dan Gunther here. Welcome to my deep dive into the most recent episode of Star Trek Lower Decks, Crisis Point. This is the show in which I take a look at the Easter eggs, canon connections, and continuity bits in the most recent episode of a newly released Star Trek show. So without further ado, let's take a look at the penultimate episode of Season 1 of Star Trek Lower Decks. At the beginning of the episode, we are introduced to a species described by Mariner as rat people, who seem to have a taste for the lizard people of the planet. These would appear to be Antikins, who were first introduced in the TNG Season 1 episode Lonely Among Us. In that episode, they also had a taste for a lizard species, the Selae. However, the lizards in this episode do not appear to be related to that species. When we come back from the opening credits, we're introduced to one of the counselors aboard the Cerritos, Counselor Miglimo, who is played by Paul F. Tompkins. Paul F. Tompkins, among other things, is Tawny Newsom's co-host on the official Star Trek podcast, Star Trek The Pod Directive. If you haven't had a chance to listen to this podcast yet, I urge you to check it out. It's been very interesting a few episodes in. Rutherford, Tendi, and Mariner are skeet shooting on the holodeck with Leonardo da Vinci. This hologram of da Vinci would seem to be similar to the one that we were introduced to in Star Trek Voyager. Da Vinci, played by John Rhys-Davies in Voyager, was a recurring holographic character. In this episode, he's played by Gary Cole. You may know him as Bill Lumbergh from the film Office Space. I personally remember him from the Babylon 5 spin-off Crusade. In a move similar to Barclay's in the TNG episode Hollow Pursuits, Boimler has crafted holograms of the senior staff of the USS Cerritos. However, in this case, it's to prepare for an interview with the captain rather than live out his personal adventures on the holodeck. Mariner co-opts Boimler's program to create a movie, and during this whole sequence, there are a number of references to Star Trek films in particular. This section of the video will be devoted to those references. So first of all, in addition to the Star Trek-specific movie tropes, we have some interesting changes, such as the change of aspect ratio and the addition of film grain to the episode. In a really nice touch, this change in aspect ratio and the film grain extends just to the holodeck doors, and later when we see Tendi leave the holodeck, we see that inside the holodeck it still has the film widescreen aspect ratio, and outside it is the regular HD TV television aspect ratio. The opening credits to Mariner's film are in the Star Trek The Next Generation opening credits font, and specifically this part here showing the film's title seems to get its inspiration from the Star Trek The Next Generation Season 5 title, which had those crazy blue warp lines coming out from the title of the show, unlike in every other season of Star Trek The Next Generation. The music during the opening credits and several other sequences during the film I would describe as Horner-esque, very much evoking the feeling of James Horner's scores for the films Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan and Star Trek III The Search for Spock. There are several moments where the music feels like it's going to swell into some part of the Wrath of Khan soundtrack, but instead the Lower Decks theme is played in that style. I loved it. As the senior officers and Boimler approach the Cerritos while in space dock, we get a very long, slow fly around, much like in Star Trek The Motion Picture, the kind of infamous/famous among Star Trek fans scene, where Kirk and Scotty take a long, slow fly around the Enterprise to the strains of Jerry Goldsmith's The Motion Picture theme. In fact, there's another nod, I think, to Kirk in Star Trek The Motion Picture, where we see the chief engineer of the Cerritos, Billups, moved to tears at the beauty of the Cerritos, much like Kirk was getting misty-eyed looking at the Enterprise in The Motion Picture. In the exterior shots and upon boarding the Cerritos, we see a great deal of lens flare, very much over the top. This would seem to be a bit of a dig at Star Trek 2009 and Star Trek Into Darkness, directed by J.J. Abrams. A lot of fans felt that the lens flare was over the top in these films, and, I have to say, this episode gets it pretty on the nose. With the captain's order to warp me, the Cerritos streaks off into warp in a much more ostentatious way than we usually see on the show, and this would of course seem to be another nod to the a little bit over-the-top ways in which the Enterprise goes to warp. I would say most similarly to the way the Enterprise flew off in Star Trek Into Darkness, with those really strange warp contrails behind them as well that we see here. We soon meet Vindicta, played by Beckett Mariner. Vindicta, being the villain of the film, quotes Shakespeare, much like the villain of Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, General Chang, especially with regards to The Tempest, repeating Chang's quote from that play, "Our revels now are ended." When Vindicta destroys her own ship to take out the Cerritos crashes on a nearby planet. This crash has many similarities to the crash of the Enterprise D in the film Star Trek Generations, and the crash of the Kelvin Timeline Enterprise in Star Trek Beyond. In what would seem to be another dig at Star Trek 2009 and Star Trek Into Darkness, Rutherford at one point says, "You can do all sorts of beaming things in movies," when he beams the entire crew off the ship before it crashes onto the planet's surface. I call out Star Trek 09 and Into Darkness specifically because of the transwarp beaming issue that was brought up in those films, wherein anyone could beam from anywhere in the galaxy to somewhere very far away in the blink of an eye, it seemed. In the coda of the episode, we see a soft-landed torpedo on the surface of the planet featured in the Rise of Vindicta film. This, of course, is a direct homage to the end of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, where we see that the torpedo tube that Captain Spock is interred in has soft-landed on the surface of Genesis. And finally, at the very end of the film, we get the signatures of the main cast members, a la the cast members of Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, at the end of that film. My favorite touch is the fact that Boimler dots his I's with a small Starfleet Delta. So other references not related to just merely the fact that this is a Star Trek film in episode clothing is a reference to the character of Zahn. Zahn is a very little known character in Star Trek trivia. We've never actually seen this character on screen. He was conceived of for the spin-off of the original Star Trek series, which came to be known as Star Trek Phase 2. When Leonard Nimoy was not going to join that project, Zahn was created as a full Vulcan character, played by David Gautreaux. While the Zahn character was eventually scrapped when the project was turned into Star Trek The Motion Picture, you can still see David on screen in the role of Commander Branch, the commanding officer of the Epsilon 9 station in Star Trek The Motion Picture. Zahn's name can also be seen on a staff directory placard in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Up until this episode, this was the only canon mention of the character in all of Star Trek. In the credits for Mariner's movie, Crisis Point, The Rise of Vindicta, we see the name Winger Bingston Jr. You may remember him from the episode Moist Vessel. He was the one with the one-man show, who was part of the officer training that Mariner had to attend when she was briefly promoted to the rank of lieutenant. We in fact see Winger Bingston Jr. later in the episode, but he is very quickly dispatched when Mariner's boarding pod crushes him. When getting the briefing for the Cerritos' mission, we discover that there's a fake Federation starship out there doing second contacts, the USS San Clemente. While it is not a real Federation starship, it does appear to still be named after a California city, indicating that it is in fact a California-class ship, like the Cerritos. San Clemente is a city in Orange County. In what at first blush just sounds like some random technobabble, Rutherford references the Inda controls and mentions bypassing the sativants. These would be references to strains of cannabis, an interesting reference in a Star Trek Lower Decks episode. While defending the Cerritos' bar, the holographic version of Lieutenant Shax exclaims, "When you get to hell, tell the Power Wraiths that Shax sent you. Special delivery, straight from Bajor." Shax, of course, is a Bajoran, and the Power Wraiths are that planet's version of the opposite of their gods, the Prophets. The Power Wraiths featured quite heavily in the final 2 seasons of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and even took over the body of Keiko O'Brien at one point. At one point, it's revealed that Mariner dressed up as Toby the Targ every Halloween, even though she's too old for the character. Toby the Targ was the lead character of a series of educational holoprograms for children, mentioned in the Voyager episode Author. Earlier in the Voyager episode Sunkatsi, Tom Paris mentioned to 7 of 9 that B'Elanna Torres would often take her Toby the Targ toy with her if she was leaving the Voyager for longer than a day. And finally, we get an instance of a Chekhov's gun in this episode when the skeet-shooting Da Vinci shows up at the end to dispatch the apparently regenerated Mariner a la the Genesis planet bit that we get at the end of the episode. You know, they say that if Da Vinci shows up with a gun in the first act, he'll fire it by the end of the third. Well, those were all of the references and Easter eggs I found in this very Easter egg heavy episode of Lower Decks. Were there any that I missed? Please let me know in the comments below. Thank you, of course, for watching, and thanks especially to the Patreon supporters. I really do appreciate it and couldn't do it without you. I wanted to give a special shout out to the fan group USS Corsair, who apparently watch these deep dive videos after their weekly watch of the new Lower Decks episode each week. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate it, and thanks for reaching out. It's really cool to hear from you, and I really enjoy that there are people out there that have made this show a part of their watching experience. So thank you so much for that. Thank you to everyone else for watching as well. I'll see you in the next video. As always, live long and prosper.